Welcome to our World Heritage 2021 debate. 2021 debate is a year of events focused on protection, conservation, and management of World Heritage. We want to uncover untold stories to broaden our views on heritage practices and future perspectives. Knowledge gathered this year will be published in 2022 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Convention. The Our World Heritage Initiative is created by individuals working on 100% voluntary capacity. We would like to point out that Our World Heritage provides an open dialogue platform that is based on voluntary work of session organizers and speakers. Our World Heritage welcomes diverse viewpoints in the spirit of collegial debate where mutual respect is afforded to all. Please note that the expressed views do not necessarily reflect the official position of Our World Heritage. We thank today's speakers for telling their stories, and we thank you, the listeners, for your kind interest and questions. If you want to remain up to date on our activities, you can follow our social media. We maintain channels in multiple languages to break through the language barriers and connect to local communities. You will find all links on our website, ourworldheritage.org. Thank you for being with us today, and we wish you a very fruitful event.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone, to all the people that are with us today in this session 6, Living Heritage, Linking Tangible and Intangible Heritage. This is a webinar that is part of this very important and vast initiative that it's called Our World Heritage. That was put together in a voluntary basis by people from around the world to discuss the UNESCO Convention and beyond the list, the heritage themes from the contemporary world. So this month is dedicated to the theme New Heritage Approaches. And first of all, I would like to thank Monica Schle and Vera Tangari from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro for organizing this month activities along with other partners that are making this possible, along with a lot of people that are really put a lot of effort into this. I'm Flávia Brito. I am professor at the University of São Paulo in Brazil at the School of Architecture and Urban Planning, and I'll be today the moderator of this very, to my point of view, very important debate today, and we have lots of important things to discuss on the theme. So today's session is dedicated to the changes in societies, in their environments, and the call for approaches that increase civil society engagement and appropriation of the World Heritage Sites as a tool for preservation and conservation, and for making them meaningful in people's lives. In this context, finding ways to unite and integrate tangible and intangible aspects of heritage can be a response to that challenge. This session proposes a debate about strategies, methods, and guidelines needed to overcome this distinction between tangible and intangible assets. It aims to enhance our ability to build a knowledge ecology system to overcome the threats that the sites and the populations around them have suffered in the past years. So before I present our very dear speakers, I would like to announce this disclaimer that this is a platform that provides an open dialogue and based on entirely voluntary work of session organizers and speakers. Some of the content of the presentations and discussions can point out different views, and so we welcome different viewpoints in the spirit of collegial debate and lots of dialogue and conversation. So we have the great honor to receive Maria Gravari Barbas from France. Feiki Hassan from Egypt, Teresa Williamson from Brazil, and So Shava from Zimbabwe. So we'll have the presentation in this order. And I would like to, first of all, invite Maria Gravari Barbas to do her presentation that will discuss on the difficult task of safeguarding the intangible aspects of historical cities, challenges and perspectives. Professor Maria Gravari Barbas is director of the Institute of Research and High Studies in Tourism, Institut de Recherche et d'Études Supérieures du Tourisme, à Université Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne, Parisin, and she's a well-known author of many studies in heritage. So it's my great pleasure to have you here, and I'll pass the floor for you, and I'll present the other speakers as the presentations goes on. So each of you have around 10 to 15 minutes, and I will make a sign here when the time is about to do. Okay, thank you very much. I'll leave the floor to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, Flavia. And really thanks to the organizers for this invitation. I'm really happy to be with you today and share some ideas with you. Let me share my PowerPoint. Yeah, let me just say that today there is a large number of World Heritage cities, which are one of the most represented categories of World Heritage properties. And in most World Heritage cities, material heritage is very carefully protected, very carefully preserved and restored. The inscription on the World Heritage list implies the existence of important local, regional, and national protection tools, ensuring the protection of the buildings, of the architectural details, of the gardens, of the urban compositions, etc. This results to very well-restored urban context, as in Dubrovnik, for example, World Heritage Site since 1979, or the historic district in Old Quebec, World Heritage Site since 1985. This could work perfectly if these so nicely restored urban centers were not perceived as perfect urban settings specifically, which in fact illustrate sometimes a past urban life which is now bygone. Several researchers criticized what is considered as an excessive restoration in World Heritage cities. They spoke about UNESCO Kiss of Death. This is a quote by John Starin, or about UNESCO site, or about urbanicide. Obviously, to quote here Marco De Ramo, who coined the concept, the term of UNESCO site, this is not deliberately perpetrated. On the contrary, it is committed in all good faith and with the loftiest intentions to preserve examples of heritage for the benefit of the humanity. I quote here, "It is devastating to witness the death rolls of so many cities, splendid, opulent, hectic for centuries, sometimes millennia. They had survived the vicissitudes of history, war, pestilence, earthquakes. But now, one after another, they are withering, emptying, becoming reduced to theatrical backdrops against which a bloodless pantomime is staged. Here, once life throbbed and cantankerous humanity elbowed its way, pushing and shoving. Now you will find only snack bars and stalls, all of them the same, selling local specialities, muslins, batiks, cottons, beach wraps, bracelets. So this is a quote by Marco De Ramo, published a few years ago, presenting this issue of UNESCO site. In several cities, indeed, restoration opted for what could be called as a chronological integrism or as a temporal fundamentalism, which is in fact reflects in fact ideological or nationalistic orientations. This is, for example, the case here in Quebec, where heritage is sometimes carefully recreated from scratch, as you can see in these pictures here for the Batterie Royale that you can see here at the historic old district of Quebec, rebuilt in 1979 as it used to be in 1691 on its original site after the demolition of the Hôtel Brochu, which was built on this site. So this is one of the first issues that I would like to discuss here. The second is, of course, that those very nicely restored heritage cities become very attractive, terribly attractive even for huge numbers of visitors, both metropolitan, national, and international, who tend to concentrate in quite limited spaces, sometimes in few streets, which often correspond to the theatrical backdrops against which a bloodless pantomime is staged, to take the sentence I quoted before of Marco Geramo. Most of the historical urban areas inscribed on the UNESCO list, relatively small, centrally located, very carefully restored, tend to be assimilated to urban museums. Without being systematic, there is a relationship between the hyper-conservation, aestheticization, and artification of the central urban cores of World Heritage cities and their relative monofunctionality or even their functional sclerosis. I quote again Geramo, who says that he explains that he recently, in 2014, went back to San Gimignano after 30 years of absence. Within its walls, there is not a butcher, not a greengrocer, nor genuine baker to be found. Why so? After the bars, restaurants, and souvenir shops have closed, you won't find the locals sleeping in the city center anymore. They all live outside in modern condos. And let me take here the example of the Rue des Rosiers in Le Marais neighborhood in Paris. In 2008, COS, Collection of Styles, which is the upscale brand of H&M Group, took possession of this hammam. The destruction of the tangible heritage means the hammam's interiors, and to a much larger extent of the intangible heritage, the hammam's significance, in fact, for the neighborhood, did not generate at that time any major reactions, just a kind of bitter nostalgia for a rapidly disappearing past. Only in 2015, the then new mayor of the 4th arrondissement, of the 4th district in Paris, Christophe Girard, said that local residents and politicians should have fought to keep the hammam's function, which would have allowed people, and I quote him, to stroll down Rue des Rosiers in a peignoir after a hammam. Everyday shops, a butcher, a bakery, close one after each other and only leave behind the names of the former shop, conserved in a rather fetishist way. You have here some examples from Le Marais with this former horse butcher or this baker which now sells very different objects. It is important to remind here that what is considered as a successful project of restoration of the architecture can be very severely criticized in terms of social impacts. This is the case of the first Plan de sauvegarde et de mise en valeur of Le Marais, elaborated in 1965, which, by densifying the area and by restoring the very prestigious Hôtel Particulier, clearly contributed to the touristification of the area. You can see in these slides here 3 different times of Le Marais, the Plan d'Urgot, which is an 18th century map, which in fact shows how was the area at that time, the situation in Le Marais in the 1960s, and in fact, Le Marais, as it became after the de-densification of the area. This de-densification was achieved by the demolition of several buildings, mainly of the 19th or of the 20th century, because in fact they were considered as less important. So in fact, the preservation plan, le plan de sauvegarde et de mise en valeur of Le Marais in the 20th century did not take into consideration the neighborhood's intangible heritage, the workshops, the local craftsmanship, the inhabitants, the local inhabitants. Restoration projects simply ignored local residents and local workers. And I speak here about Le Marais because it is considered as one of the most influent examples of urban restoration, which inspired many other urban restoration projects, even if this is not a UNESCO property per se, or it is marginally a UNESCO property. More generally, the restoration of the historical buildings of the central areas inscribed on the UNESCO list, such as here for Dubrovnik, brings important functional changes, anticipated or not, wanted or not. Their transformation into open-air museums is to put in relationship with their subsequent tourismification. So we enter here in a kind of vicious circle. The restoration of the built heritage contributes to the production of a place which is desirable to tourists, which in turn contributes to an increased tourism demand, which in turn tends to produce places more suitable for tourism. The relationship between heritage restoration and valorization and tourism, a fortiori, of course, over tourism, is obviously much more complex, and I don't want to oversimplify. But several examples tend to demonstrate that preservation and restoration in most World Heritage cities contributed to the creation of urban micro areas mainly dedicated to tourism and leisure. In most cases, the protected perimeter is quite small and often located within very large metropolitan areas. It becomes, therefore, a kind of playground, a playground for international tourism, but also the playground for metropolitan populations. This often generates paradoxical situations in which public money heavily invested in the restoration of private properties located inside the UNESCO perimeter contributes to social phenomena which are not always anticipated, planned, and desirable. The production of those urban playgrounds contributes to the progressive departure of the inhabitants, with, of course, the very well-known example of Venice, but this is only one of various other examples. Local inhabitants who move away either because they cannot cope with the difficulties of transport and of the nature of the existing housing stock, or because they do not find anymore the necessary services and shops they need for their everyday life, or because they are just kicked out by their landlords who can make more important revenues by short-term tourism rentals than long-term housing contracts. In several cities, this results to tensions and conflicts, mainly with the inhabitants who still live there. Obviously, World Heritage urban centers are not tourist enclaves, and even if the number of local inhabitants is decreasing, those who still live there are striving for a different model of a local urban life. So most of World Heritage cities face this double problem. The management of quite important and sometimes very huge numbers of visitors and tourists in small urban heritage areas, and the preservation and management of their functional diversity of their local inhabitants, the ordinary expressions of everyday life, which is for me part of their intangible heritage. In conclusion, just to be very short for this first part of the discussion, What I really would like to say here is that we need, in fact, in our World Heritage cities, we need to stress the discrepancy between ambitious measures, ambitious tools, and regulations concerning the protection of the material heritage, which is in most cities very well preserved, and the lack in a capitalistic and globalized world of measures able to protect the functional diversity, the quality of everyday life, and the maintaining of permanent inhabitants. So in our neoliberal societies, how can we, in fact, we do have the tools to deal with the tangible heritage, but we need to find new models, new social and new business model in order to cope also with intangible heritage. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maria. This was a quite interesting presentation. And with no further ado, I will pass the floor to Sol Shava. He will do the presentation, Living Heritage, Linking Intangible and Intangible Cultural Heritage. Professor Sol teaches at the Environmental Education, Education for Sustainable Development at the Department of Science and Technology Education at the University of South Africa. So thank you very much for being here. It's a really great pleasure to have you with us and to hear your presentation.
Good evening to you all. We just had a power cut, so I'm trying to sort of reorient myself and get everything working here. I hope it will all work. So I'm looking at the links between tangible and intangible heritage from a Southern African perspective, and on the map there is what we refer to as Southern Africa, which is all the countries that are within the SADC region. I'm based here in South Africa, but I've worked in most of the countries that are within Southern Africa there. When we look at tangible and intangible heritage, we actually see a link there in the lived lives of the local communities within Southern Africa, where the intangible heritage is embodied in people's cultures and embedded in their practices within their lived environment. When we look at intangible cultural heritage, it is actually, its source is the biophysical environment, the lived environment of these local communities. And embedded within the tangible heritage are actually the intangible aspects and vice versa. In other words, you also see the intangible within the tangible as well as seeing the tangible within the intangible aspects. I'll just give a few examples here. One major vegetation in Southern Africa is what we refer to as the savanna, which is characterized by trees and grasslands. When we look at those particular grasslands as a natural vegetation, we lose sight of the fact that those grasslands are actually existent because of fire activities by the local communities. When grasslands are left alone, they tend to develop what we refer to as moribund grass, which is dead grass. And that grass actually has a negative impact on the vegetation in that, firstly, it is not edible. And secondly, if left in that state, what tends to happen is the grasslands become encroached by thickets of thorny bush, and then that actually changes the vegetation, and in a way it impacts on the wildlife within the area, which is predominantly quite a number of grazers that actually graze on the grass. So the local communities periodically set fire to the grasslands when they dry up in the winter season. And in doing so, they actually encourage the regeneration of those grasses. And that is a cyclical process that maintains the savanna vegetation as it is. And in the process, it also makes the vegetation suitable for the wildlife that exists within these savanna ecosystems that we are actually referring to. So what that is actually showing is that link between the lived environment, which is the savanna ecosystem, and the local communities who are maintaining these savanna ecosystems through these fire regimes that they actually have, where they periodically burn the grasses in order to allow for new growth within those particular grasslands. Another example of this nature culture link that I'm talking about is the practice of coppicing, which is done by local communities. On the right hand, within that same slide, you can see some of the savanna trees that are there. And you notice that some of them actually have the branches lopped off. And this is what the local communities normally do when they are gathering wood for fire and also for other purposes such as wooden poles that they utilize for construction purposes. When they lop off these branches, they actually allow for these trees to regenerate and to grow. And at the same time, they are not killing or destroying these trees. So that practice actually enables vegetative regeneration while at the same time providing resources to the local communities that we are actually I'm referring to here. So it's a practice, it's a cultural practice by the local communities, which has a beneficial advantage to the vegetation within the area. In that it gets rid of the old or dead branches. It also still maintains those trees alive, despite the fact that they are being utilized for firewood. And I also have some pictures there of traditional huts that have been used by local communities in the past. There are still some communities that utilize this type of traditional huts at present. The one on the top upper left is a Zulu Heart, and it is made of branches or saplings of trees that are shaped together into a frame, and that frame is covered on top by thatch grass. The thatch grass and the branches that they actually utilize to make the hut are all derived from the local environment. And what is interesting is that if these huts get old or they degrade, they are naturally degraded by other species within the environment, such as, example, termites. So they are biodegradable to a large extent. The inside of these huts has mud on it, and over the mud, they normally use wet cow dung to smear on the inside. And what that cow dung actually does is it insulates the hut and it keeps it warm during winter, and at the same time, it keeps it cool during summer. The thatch keeps it cool during summer. The same kind of hut is found on the right. That is a Nama hut from the San communities, the Bushmen communities. They utilize more or less the same kind of frame from these saplings or branches of trees, but instead of using grass, they actually use reeds, which is another grass species in this case. They don't use sage grass, but they use these reeds. And what they do with the reeds is they weave them into mats, and these mats are then laid over the frame, the wooden frame, and that becomes a hut. And when they move to another area, what they do is they simply take off those mats and roll them, and then they would actually then make a home in a new place. At the bottom is another type of hut, which is made from the same structure. You have thatch on and wooden frame on top, and on the walls, what is there is poles, and those poles are covered with a dagger, or what we call clay. The clay is smeared over the poles, and that forms the frame of the house in this case. These are also huts that are made from local material that is available from the lived environment, and all those materials are actually biodegradable. If the hut gets abandoned or left, it will degrade into the natural environment. And this is one way where you actually see that nature culture links that I'm actually talking about. There is the tangible aspect, which is the huts that you see. There is the intangible aspect, the process of building the huts, and the relationship that is actually there with the environment. Another aspect that shows the nature culture link is taboos and totems. I've put in there on the right hand side a picture of an eland. My surname is Shava, or my totem is Shava. Shava is actually the eland. And in our community, anybody who is from the Shava clan is not allowed to feed or to eat the eland. And what it does is, within that community, because people have different totems of animal or plant species, they don't utilize those animal species because it's taboo for them to eat their own totem. And what that does is it allows the selective conservation of those species within the community. Not everybody is hunting for the same species when they go out to hunt, and that in its way is a way of actually conserving. There are other taboos that are utilized by the communities, like, for example, the hunting period is such that when the animals are having their offspring, during that particular season, no hunting is allowed, and in that way, that sort of conserves the species. There is also the nature culture link in medicinal plant harvesting and conservation. For example, on the left hand side, there is bark being harvested from a tree, and it is the traditional healers have this culture of harvesting bark only from the eastern and western side of the tree. And when they harvest it in that way, in that manner, they avoid ring-barking the tree. And what that does is it conserves the species that we are actually talking about.
I think he went out probably. I'm not sure. So yeah, because he said he was out of power. Um, so I think the best thing is that we move on, maybe, and then if he comes, we can go back. Okay. Um, is that fine with you, Teresa? Because it would be you right now.
Of course.
Okay, so I think Professor So he had a problem with his power. He said before that he ran out of power. So I think this happened again. Unfortunately, it cut his presentation, and so I will pass to Teresa Williamson, and she will do the speak Rio de Janeiro's favelas as living heritage. Intangible to Whom. Teresa Williamson is Executive Director of Cataclytic Communities in Brazil. So thank you so much for being with us. And it's now on with you, Teresa.
Okay, thank you very much, Flavia. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Before I show the slides, I just wanted to mention that I'll be presenting from the perspective of an advocacy urban planner. I'm an urban planner. I've been working for 20 years with favelas, leading an NGO called Catalytic Communities. And so my goal is just to provide an overview for us to think about and to learn from all of you, because this is one of the first times I've had the opportunity to discuss the idea of heritage in relation to favelas in a forum like this. So I'm looking forward to the discussion after. I'll be using a lot of images, and there's some slides that I'll go through very quickly, but I think since we're all from very different places, it's important to give an idea of the landscape here. And so I'll use a lot of pictures, and there's some slides with text that I'll share quickly, but I'm leaving them there just so that you have access to them if you want to look later. And I've shared, for those on Zoom, the link to the presentation so you can take a look yourself now or later. And then the presentation is going to be sort of, I'm going to very quick background on our organization. And then I'm going to talk about favelas from this different vantage point, talk about favela museums, which is a growing movement here in Rio, and then share some concluding reflections. So I'll go ahead and share the slides now. Okay. So again, I'm going to start just talking a little bit about our organization. Very quickly, we've worked for 20 years as an asset-based organization in Rio, supporting favela organizers. We support them with the shifting in the narrative about favelas so that we can help develop these communities in sustainable ways and preserve the assets that they build through collective titling, through community land trusts. We also do data around COVID-19. And then again, before I talk about the substance of the presentation, just thought I would share this because I think it's directly relevant. A few years ago, our organization, Catalytic Communities, did an assessment of how our work dialogues with the Sustainable Development Goals. And essentially what we found through this reflection was that it's as if we're a tree, right? So the goal of the organization is to build sustainable cities and communities, specifically Rio's favelas, which contemplates everything from water and education, right, to healthcare, et cetera. And that would be Sustainable Development Goal 11. But the trunk of the tree, which allows for all that to happen and which is a precursor, is social justice. So you can't have sustainable cities if you don't have socially just cities. But then when we dug deeper to the roots of this tree, we found that there were a few elements that were missing from the Sustainable Development Goals that are necessary for social justice. And I just wanted to highlight that the main one we identified was sort of the right to roots and belonging. Recognize their heritage, recognize their history, and remain in their location as favelas become consolidated. So in that context, I'm going to quickly reintroduce favelas. Some of you are probably very familiar with them. Some of you know informal settlements in your own countries. So I'll just share that in Rio, they come from a very severe context of slavery. For those who don't know, Rio, the city alone, received more than 5 times number of enslaved Africans as the entire United States, and slavery lasted 60% longer than the US. So we're talking about a historical context where favelas formed within 10 years of abolition of slavery, and that is really at the root of these communities' identity, even if it's not stated or recognized by most people, even in Rio. The first favela was formed in 1897, and to this day, you can look at racial maps of the city and see the strong correlation between white areas as upper class, developed, formalized neighborhoods, and informal favelas where Black and brown residents are the majority. And again, I'm going through some of these slides quickly so you have access later, but lived through a 124-year history in favela communities of policies of neglect and repression as the primary policies. These are not the lack of policy. These are active policies here in Rio. With window of change in the late 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, where we saw some laws shift and more investment in these communities, but we've seen a regression in the last decade. So what we have today is a city with 1,000 favela communities housing nearly a quarter of the population. And most people in favelas live in communities, they're actually over 50 years old, and they're all over the urban fabric. And this is important because people often translate favelas as slums, but slum implies a level of precariousness and temporality, which no longer is the rule for Rio's favelas. And if you're going to generalize about these communities, the only things they have in common are things that are not objectively bad or good. There are neighborhoods that develop as a solution for housing. There's no outside regulation. They're built by residents for themselves, and they constantly evolve. So as favelas become what we call consolidated within this context of favelas, people want to stay in their communities. They want to invest. They have a sense of history and heritage in their communities. And just summarizing in a different way, favelas are affordable housing, informal, self-built, and unique. And so there's a lot of intangible qualities in these communities. And I'm not going to, as an urban planner, I've come to appreciate them in a whole host of ways that my peers in developed contexts are constantly trying to adapt their cities and make them more affordable, and make the architecture more responsive, increase social exchange, pedestrians. All of these things are common in favela contexts. We've been able to document sociocultural assets, which of course are those that most people recognize in favelas as tangible. People think of, Brazilian culture, whether it's carnival, whether it's samba, whether it's funk, capoeira, the maintenance of historic cultural, Afro-Brazilian especially, culture. And then there's urbanistic and economic qualities of these communities as well. Different urban and the lack of communities respond themselves to meet basic needs. Urban design varied, a lot of culture where people appropriate the streets, pedestrian orientation, and so on. So again, another slide I'm just going to share quickly to provide an overview, but it's important to recognize that the informal city is not the absence of formality. This is unfortunately a misunderstanding that many people in government apply, that the solution to the informal is to bring in formalization. We're actually talking about two different cultures, and many of the differences are intangible assets. So in the case of the formal city, we have complexity is regulated, right, is limited through regulation. In the informal city, you have increasing complexity, which can be a good or bad thing. Again, it's not objectively a bad thing. In the formal city, there's so many elements that are monetized. There are bureaucratic barriers, centralized planning, right? The services and exchanges are monetized. They're private environments. In the informal city, you have barriers, economic barriers removed through relationships. You have a lot of services are demonetized, provided through mutual support. Again, intangible processes of support and economic development. And so it's not a surprise to organizations like ours in Rio that are working with favelas that actually in some surveys they find residents incredibly satisfied to live in these communities. In others, no. In this particular case, it was the end of an economic boom period in Brazil. And the study found that 81% of residents liked their favelas, 66% wouldn't leave their communities, and economic growth in that previous decade had been higher in these communities than in other parts of the city. And then finally, in this, just finalizing this section of the presentation, before talking about favela museums, I just wanted to borrow this slide from David Krakauer of the Santa Fe Institute. There's two slides. This one's very confusing to the non-scientists out there, including myself. But basically, the idea is that you actually have in nature, you have adaptive systems develop with a certain amount of what you might call randomness or chaos, a lack of regulation, let's say. So he applied the same context to art. and found that, to provide examples here, right, there's a certain amount of complexity that you get that's sort of a sweet spot where in nature you would get ecosystems that are very diverse, that depend on diversity for them to function. And then in art, he gives this example for those who find this a better point of comparison. And then with his permission, I apply the same logic to human settlements. And so what I would argue is that actually some consolidated favelas, because of the level of complexity they achieve, might actually be higher quality urban environments if they can be improved and invested in further, and then regulation can recognize that instead of trying to change them into something else. And then just again to finalize this section, this was back in 2012 when Rio was declared the first urban landscape as a World Heritage Site. Raquel Holniki, who was Special Rapporteur for Housing for at the time, she specifically commented on how some historic favelas are in this area, and so should be considered a part of this heritage. So with that backdrop, just understanding of the history and the importance of these communities and what they've built over time, I wanted to talk about the movement of favela museums, which in a sense are an attempt to make this intangible tangible, and why they exist, why they came to be. I'll be talking specifically about community museums that are part of the Sustainable Favela Network, which is a network that our organization has been managing and developing since 2017, when we mapped community organizations across Rio's favelas that were doing sustainable and resilience building work. And we found that 24 of those organizations declared cultural heritage conservation one of the main environmental sustainability issues they tackled. So they actually recognize cultural heritage as part of environmental conservation. And it's really interesting. I think it's worth noting that within this network, as community organizers decided what elements they wanted to incorporate into thinking about favela sustainability, they made memory and culture one of the 7 working groups, along with solar energy, water, sewage, gardens, reforestation, solid waste, and so on. And why did they do this? Well, it's because of the importance that memory and recognition of heritage has to conservation in communities. If somebody feels a sense of belonging and a sense of permanence in their community, they are much more likely to take care of it. And so it's in that context that last year, the Sustainable Favela Network developed a museum, a guide to favela museums and memories, where they were able to identify 26 different favela and other peripheral community-based museums and memory programs in Rio. You guys can check it out at the link on this previous slide. I will share it as well. And I'll give a few examples now. So the Favela Museum, it's located in Rio's South Zone in the heart of the central sort of tourist district, Ipanema, in the favelas of Pavão, Pavãozinho, Cantagalo. It's a territorial museum. It's a museum that you experience walking through the neighborhood with local residents who tell the history and culture, and they also do activities like recognizing the women who have made the community what it is, and other actions of the sort. There's the Maré Museum, which is a physical installation, like we would think of a traditional museum, in Maré, which is a favela in the north zone of Rio, which helps preserve the history of the community. In fact, in this example here on the right is what the original houses looked like, well, not blue and so on, but they were on stilts because the area was originally occupied an area of the Bay of Guanabara Bay. And then I'll give a couple of examples now, where community museums were, all of these examples I should mention are an attempt to recognize the importance of these communities and mark their importance to the city at large, and also preserve the community's memories, recognizing the importance of memory to guaranteeing the improvement of neighborhoods over time, and investment from residents and outsiders. The Evictions Museum, this one came out of the 2016 Olympics. It was founded 5 years ago in May, in fact. It's mostly active in Vila Autódromo, which is the favela that was evicted for the Olympics. This particular community was, about 700 families. 20 of them remained, and they've dedicated the remaining area to this museum and to preserving the community's legacy. You can see here some images right as when the Olympics were about to happen, right a few months before, on the site where residents' homes had been removed, where they put in installations with elements of the homes that had been destroyed. This is another example of a community, in this case, Providencia. It's not a community museum, but they were also using installations to help preserve memory and prevent eviction. Local photographer Mauricio Ara, he took photos of residents who were facing eviction, and he plastered them on the sides of homes to create a human presence, to try to make it more tangible, the people who are going to be impacted by that eviction. They managed to stop that particular eviction, but elsewhere in the community where they didn't stop evictions, the same photographer worked with Portuguese sculptor Vils to create sculptures on the sides of homes featuring the people who had been evicted from those homes right in the community. So these are all attempts to make things tangible. And finally, the example of the Horto Museum, also in Rio's South Zone, a community that, even though it's got 200 years in this area, is constantly being threatened with eviction under the pretense of it being a recent occupation, which it definitely is not. And so they've worked hard to create a museum to tell this story, tell this history, and preserve the history so that the community can remain. There are a few videos that you can check out later. They're embedded in the presentation that happened over the past year as the Guide to Memories was developed and published. I highly recommend checking that out, these out. And then just to conclude, sorry, this keeps wanting to play. I'm trying to get to the next slide. There we go. Some concluding reflections. I didn't go into the detail of Vila Autódromo, right? That particular community where I mentioned there were 700 families and 20 remained. But in pre-Olympic Rio, we actually saw 80,000 people evicted from their homes. And these were often from quite consolidated, well-located favelas. It was a great cost to the public and with questionable positive impact on the city. We also saw gentrification in favelas. And these are the product of not recognizing of so much value being intangible to outsiders and often to residents themselves because of the social implication and the social pressures that face these communities. In Vila Autódromo, right, it was a stark example of what we lose. This was a community that was actually quite developed. A lot of the young people were in university. People would move there because they wanted a better life for their kids. There was no drug trafficking, no militias. It would have cost only 14 million reais to urbanize the community, to upgrade it, to bring it up to standard. The city ended up spending over 300 million evicting residents from there. Again, because people saw it as a favela, they saw it as a slum. Outsiders weren't, it was easy to policy to pass, although the amount of community resistance made it so that in the end, with outside support, made it that in the end, this particular community was able to have some homes. You see in the bottom right there, 20 homes remain, and those residents, again, have created the Evictions Museum. So again, just completing, I'd like to call on us to drop the double standards. There's so many terms in urban planning in my field that talk about, how some level of informal urban planning is a good thing, or tactical urbanism is when people take over urban space and make something of it in the absence of government. You have movements around community dangerous playgrounds for kids in the US and Europe to try to make create spaces for kids to play that aren't so preserved. I'm forgetting my words here. And at the same time, you have World Heritage sites, which most of the historic towns, they were actually built informally. Informal development is how cities developed before a few hundred years ago, before industrialization. And so they're recognized for their, quote, vernacular urban fabric or improvised urban design, yet favelas aren't. This is a favela on the left, Santorini on the right. A lot of this is subjective, right? And it's imposed perceptions based on dominant worldviews. So what if Rio embraced its unique history and each of the city's favelas recognized those intangible and tangible contributions to the city and then supported their future development in ways that honored resident history? What if we invested in decentralized urban planning in a place like Rio, where communities control their destiny and technical allies support those visions instead of the other way around? And then finally, we could use this case as a model globally. The UN predicts 1 in 3 people will live in urban informal settlements by 2050. So we do need new approaches where we recognize the value of these communities, the intangible value, and we don't try to necessarily monetize or shift that into a tangible framework. So I encourage everyone to reach out to me if you have any questions. And again, the presentation is available on Google Docs, and I hope to hear from you and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. And before we move to Professor Feki Hassan, I will go back to Professor Soul because he managed to get in. And so if he wishes to wrap up his presentation, and if you do, and Professor Soul, I don't know if you can hear me. If you are on.
Yeah, I can hear. I think I can come in last because I'm still trying to get.
Okay, great. So we'll go straight on. We move. Thank you so much, and we'll move to our next presentation. Professor Feki Hassan from Egypt. I'll thank you very much for being here. His presentation, Heritage for Life, Egypt's Living Heritage Community Engagement and Recreating the Past project. Professor Hassan, he teaches cultural heritage management and archaeology. He's a director in cultural heritage in the management program in French University in Egypt, emeritus in Petrie Professor, University College in London, UK. So thank you, Professor, and I'll leave it to you. I'm not sure if he's on. To me, he freezed. You are all, yeah, I can see Maria and Teresa, they are moving, so it's fine. And I cannot see Professor, he seems to be freezed for me. So we have to probably wait a bit. And if he comes back. No, he left the room. Yeah, so I think we can, I'm not sure if we should move on and start our debate while he manages to come back. And I'll do some remarks. I think that it's very interesting because Professor Maria Gravari-Barbas, she told us in the very beginning about this this quite common issue of urbanicide and of UNESCO side, and then importance to build to look beyond the material aspect of the places, that in many cases, mostly in Europe, the places are indeed well protected. So this isn't really the issue in some cases. The thing is that people that live in these places are getting evicted, are moving out, or aren't being considered in the preservation policies. And so she said that we most find ways to protect these tangible and intangible aspects in order to maintain it. So I would have a question for you. And thinking also in the Teresa Williamson's presentation, where she showed probably the opposite of this situation is that in places where the material aspects are not quite considered, indeed we are used to seeing these places with a lot of prejudice. despite of all the urban debates and the cultural debates and the way in which favelas are considered in Brazilian culture, despite of that, they are from today still seen as seen with a lot of prejudice. And Heritage has a lot of difficulties to addressing these places, because the authorized heritage discourse has a lot of difficulties looking beyond the aesthetic issues. So I was intrigued if, and I really wish that, first of all, I really wish, and I do think about heritage, living heritage, in a way that it might consider the favelas. This would be, I think we would transpose a lot of problems if we manage to do the favelas, to recognize favelas as heritage. We probably can solve a lot of other problems that heritage has, because it seems that a lot of prejudice from the aesthetic aspects will be overcome. But still, we have this very difficult problem, that is the heritage side, or the urbanist side, or the UNESCO side. So I would ask for Teresa, is this could be a problem when heritage crosses the lives of the favelas? How can we escape from that? And I would ask then to Maria, if there, I'm sure there are a lot of experiences that go beyond the material aspects. They're not quite much, but if you could think of experiences that could overcome, for example, what happens in the Marais in Paris, that is completely it's packed with tourists, it's the case that you've shown with us. So how can we find ways in which people are considered, and that heritage can play an important role, but it could overcome these inequalities, because I think it's that what we're talking about. So I put two questions. I think Professor is coming back, and if he manages, I would propose if you could hold on.
I'm back.
Great.
I'm sorry.
I just put on two questions for them, and so they can think about it. And if you don't mind, we will move to Professor Hassan, because I'm afraid he might we might lose him, and so we don't. And we really want to hear Egypt, because I think Egypt might be something between the two presentations and the two situations in terms of urban fabric. So thank you so much, Professor. I've already presented you, so I'll move straight on to your presentation. Okay, please be welcome to do your presentation.
That's for me, right?
Right. I've already presented you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Yes, of course. Okay, I'll just go ahead and share my presentation. So that we can begin to see some of the issues that I will be dealing with. I was just saying that I am thankful that I am with all of you to join in this very exciting endeavor to deal with the relationship between tangible and intangible. I think, just to summarize my point of view, is that I think there is an intractable problem originating with the term tangible intangible from the beginning. It goes back to the creation of this concept as a contradictory or a counterpart or an opposite to tangible. And I think this is one of the most unfortunate issues. I think also there is a problem of looking at tangible heritage, intangible heritage, as folklore, as festivals, as songs, not as a way of living, not as the wisdom of people and their memories and their sense of belonging and all of that. That's being ignored usually when we look at intangible heritage being applied. The third issue, I think we also fail to connect local communities with the intellectuals in their own environment and or capital in or nation. And I think this relationship between the vernacular and the formal is one that I think need to be addressed. I already mentioned this unfortunate disparity in the conception. So it's before we start about the strategy and the actions and the tactics, I think we need to tackle this problem of the conceptual difference between the two. I was lucky to be part of a UNESCO meeting when they attempted to integrate the two. And I think the problem to me was that many of the people that have been dealing with intangible heritage, at least at that time, were coming from a different field, from folklore, and there was no common language. I think we need to create a common language. This is the meeting that was in 2004 in Nara, Japan, and clearly the gap between the two has not been bridged yet. My conclusion at that time, which has been published, is that we have to see both of them as elements of culture. Both are products of culture. So we have to go back to culture as the way by which they are integrated. I think Sol has also brought up a very interesting point, which also is another problem in the conventions, that where is the cultural landscape? I think we need to combine tangible, intangible, and landscape, whether it's a cultural landscape, whether it's a forest or a park or a city, because a city is also a cultural landscape. This difficulty of a dialogue need to be established, and we need to emphasize the very important aspect of intangible heritage, that it is tied to living communities. So it allows us to talk about living heritage and instead of tangible or intangible. And my proposal is that we have to emphasize the role of cultural perspective of living communities, whether they are the people in the local community or other people associated with them, in recognizing, constructing, and valorizing heritage by which the past is recreated. Because of course, heritage is a construct, and so we have to see the process, the dynamics by which the past is brought back to bear on the present. Given the background that I had at that meeting in 2004, I carried this issue with me and finally was able to have a project that involved community engagement in recreating the past. It was done in conjunction with Dr. Caroline Rooney from Kent University, and the project was entitled Egypt's Living Heritage, Community Engagement in Recreating the Past. We selected historical Cairo, given its rich and varied Islamic monuments spanning the last 1,000 years. More importantly, many Egyptians, whether they're living in this area or not, feel that this is their own history, this is their own heritage. This is something that they do not get from books. That's something that they can live, breathe, and eat, in a sense. The aim was to explore and activate the notion of living heritage as the outcome not only of the preservation and continuity of traditional crafts, which everybody does, but actually to see how the living heritage is a dynamic process in which the local community as well as intellectuals, artists, painters engage. So the activities in this project included the relationship between the local communities, their own heritage, and contemporary visual arts. We were lucky to be able to get 15 eminent Egyptian contemporary painters to have a seminar in which the community was involved. Young people from outside the community were also involved. And then we were able, after that seminar and looking at the relation between heritage and art, is to have an exhibition in one of the main galleries in Egypt, which provided for the public a view of how heritage can be represented or presented, I should say, visually in the work of contemporary artists. So this emphasizes the value of heritage because it has an added value that we give to cultural heritage, and it loses to have the stigma of being something vernacular and less important. We were also able to bring together young artists to have another seminar for them and to take them on a tour in this area. They included ceramicists and painters and architects, and they were able eventually to produce their own materials through the project and exhibit it in one of the historical houses. This was during the tour, having these young people with us. And this is the brochure for the exhibition that they mounted with a variety of ways by which the past were represented. This way we have a continuity and a combination between the local community and the young artists who should carry on these views in their own careers. Here is another aspect of this with the place where the exhibition was made. We also looked at the musical heritage. In addition to collecting songs, etc., as most people do, we were able to have another seminar with musicians, local musicians, as well as inviting another group of musicians who were reviving the classical Arabic music. So we had a combination of the folk music and this recreation of classical Arabic music. And as a result of that, we had an interesting seminar, exchange of views about how this intangible musical heritage can be fitted in a new format and reach more audience. And also we had, of course, a musical event in which everybody participated. Then this is very similar to the idea that was presented about the community museum. So we had an interesting exhibition that was based on collecting all the things that were used by local people in their own lives, contributions by the local people and things that are no longer available in the community. And like the sewing machine and the telephone, the old fashioned telephone and so on. And we collected also the memories of the people and invited the local community. And this was really a major hit in terms of bringing tangible and intangible together, because people were excited, and especially children who had not witnessed that. So the combination of the parents and the children reminiscing about these things, and some of them did not have them. We did not present these just as objects. And I think that's important in the interpretation of these pieces. We presented them as items that contributed to social change. The sewing machine, the hand sewing machine, was one of the most important vehicles of modernization in Egypt. And discussing that and discussing the role of the post, before, of course, we had our own mobile phones, etc., and old telephones. All of these were looked at in terms of the social dynamics, so that our aim was to reveal that people create their own history, and that history is dynamic, and that heritage is something that they can opt for and see how it works, so that they can own their own destiny. In addition, we looked at documentary films and looked at the relationship between documentary films and heritage. And we had also a seminar on that. We showed documentaries, and we even had a training workshop for people to be able to do photography. And it would have been great if we can also present their films, but of course the time of the project was limited. But this is something that people can present their own movies about their own communities, I think would be something quite important. In fact, we were first interested in the relationship between literature and heritage. Many of you may know Naguib Mahfouz, the Nobel Prize writer. But in Egypt, he is known for the work he has done on this historical Cairo in his trilogy, the 3 novels that he has done inspired by this community. And for most Cairenes, the people who live in Cairo, who have never been to this area, they discover this community, they discover this historical Cairo through his works. So we also organized a symposium in which we brought together eminent critics and literary writers and novel writers to explore this link between literature and heritage. We also had a workshop for aspiring young writers so they can begin to write their own stories or novels or plays inspired by this kind of heritage. And this is the poster that we had. And of course, we had a lot of publicity in the newspaper, which was good for the community to realize that their work and the community is being appreciated by the formal cultural aspects. One of the intriguing dimensions of this project, because we had one of the participants, she was the director of the Freud Museum in London. And so we decided maybe it would be worthwhile to explore dreams and see how dreams are reflective or ways of reinterpreting the environment in which they lived and their own heritage. So we had this collective session in which local people shared their own dreams, and we had from local communities professional interpreters who were respected by the community, and we had a collective reinterpretation looking at that. And of course, it was very interesting because we realized the importance of the religious element of heritage in the dreams, which may not have been shown by other aspects. So this is one way of exploring a hidden dimension of the intangible heritage. We even had the children draw their own dreams, which was quite fascinating. We also looked at the artisans and the craftspeople in the area, recorded all the activities, and tried to show how they can be joined with designers so that the crafts and artists and designers can create a new product to promote economic development and overcome the issue of poverty and lack of appeal of the just traditional crafts. And so here is one of the sessions and the exhibition then that we have made of the crafts in this group. We also attempted to reach the people and especially the children through storytelling. And I think that was a very effective way of linking with the intangible heritage and its own methods of interpreting the culture to themselves and to others. And we think that the way forward also is to couple the different dimensions of cultural traditions, whether they're ideational or intellectual, with performative and communicative approaches in a single theoretical framework based on the notion that the spectrum of heritage is broader than academic specialities, and to recognize the pivotal role of writers, artists, along with ordinary people in the recreation of what we cherish and value as heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this very inspiring presentation. And now go back to Professor So. I don't think he's here. I think he ran out of power probably once again. So I'll move on to our Q's and A's as we wait for Professor So to come back and maybe participate in the debate and wrap up his presentation. And so I've already asked two questions to Teresa and Professor Maria Gravalho Barbas, and I will pose a question to Professor Hassan, and then we can start our discussion. I think that the three presentations spoke about the importance of people and the social actors in heritage. This is one of the most important discursive turns in heritage. Professor Daniel Fabre told us that in France, the heritage turn in the 80s was about people engaging in heritage and caring about heritage and the emotions that they are implied in heritage. This involvement in heritage is probably one of the most important things that we are seeing in the last decades. But besides that, it's very difficult that the heritage in more effective way in the sense of the institutions that they engaged with people, that they really take people into consideration. And I would ask to Professor Hassan, because in his presentation we saw, are you there? I don't know. Yes, you are. You moved. Thank you.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thank you so much. We saw a lot of people in the project, and so I would, and this struck me because it's not always easy to engage, although a lot of people have a lot of things to say about heritage. And when we do any, sometimes it's common sense that people don't care about heritage, but this is not true. And when I saw your presentation, I saw it previously and today, it was quite impressive that there is a lot of people implied in these activities. So I would ask you, how did you engage? How this educational and this participation process took place, and how did you manage to do this? And how does it in the institutions in Egypt? How does this work? So I will go back. I already asked the questions for them, so I'll go back to Professor Maria, and then Teresa, and then you, and probably there are a lot of probably some other questions might arise, and then we can do another session. So I'll pass to you, Professor Maria, and then.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Flavia. Thanks for this great question. And thank you also, Teresa, for your presentation. I think that our two presentations were somehow the yin and the yang, two different approaches to see the same problem, in fact. And I do agree with Fakri. We cannot dissociate tangible and intangible, though it is dissociated currently by decision makers, by politics, by doctrines, by charts, by everybody and everything. I heard today that the last kindergarten, which is located in the Ile Saint-Louis, this is the very center of Paris, closed. And it closed because of lack of permanent inhabitants. This means that this central part of Paris becomes, as I said before, a kind of playground, a leisure place, not only for tourism, in fact, because there is a lot also of local and metropolitan visitation. So how do we fight this? I think that for me it's clear, and it comes from the two examples of Paris and of Rio. Either politics, politics means political will, and of course we find heritage as also something which is built thanks to the political will, and civil society means militants. So politics and militants, I think that for me are two of the main ways that we can eventually change things. Change things means what? Means that either we consider that we can just accept this laissez-faire. So laissez-faire means that Paris, obviously, and the central areas of Paris will be extremely attractive and desirable for other functions than residential ones. And laissez-faire means also that an area like the one you presented, Teresa, in Villa Autodromo, it will just disappear because it does not have any material importance, and because there are other projects that can be located there. So this is the normal situation. The normal situation is that Le Marais will be hyper-protected as a kind of built frame, because obviously apartments and bars and restaurants generate huge values, and Villa Autodromo will disappear because no value. While you show that in this place there is a lot of social value and a lot of intangible heritage, and I try to show that in Paris there are some issues concerning this intangible heritage. Yeah, so I think that we need to invent tools. And in fact, the only thing that, again, in a neoliberal society, the only thing that Paris can do, the mayor of Paris can do, is to buy the shops. There is not any other way. So the city buys the shops and eventually says, okay, in this shop here, we cannot have a bar, we cannot have a restaurant, we cannot have Airbnb. We need to have some social functions which are important for the local life. So yeah, politics and militants.
Okay, I'll pass to Teresa.
Okay, thank you so much. No, it's a very interesting question. Asking if UNESCO side, urban side can eventually make its way into favelas and what that might look like. How to prevent that is the first thing I think about, because it absolutely could if we thought about it. In fact, in the pre-Olympic period, I hinted at gentrification in my presentation, but we did see it in some favelas. Upscale people buying up land in 3 or 4 favelas in particular, and developing it into restaurants and bars. That even though that wasn't through a specific process of heritage conservation, I could see a process of heritage conservation that was intentionally done on the part of the government, for example, producing the same results. So it's sort of a warning. And so in relation to that period here in Rio, we actually did start thinking about how to prevent this sort of thing. And the main strategy, the most comprehensive strategy, let's say, that we identified would be the introduction of community land trusts in favelas. And in Brazil, they don't exist in Brazil, but they have been introduced, for example, in favelas in Puerto Rico, very successfully in the last 20 years. And it's a case that I think everybody should know about, the Caño Martín Peña, the Fideicomiso. It's in San Juan, Puerto Rico. 8 favela communities decided, instead of asking the government or agreeing to the government's attempt to individually title them, which you would think is a good thing in an informal settlement, the community actually studied over 2 years and hundreds of meetings and decided they wanted an alternative strategy. And they ended up settling on, how do we essentially retrofit the community land trust model? And for those who aren't familiar with it, a community land trust, typically it's where a nonprofit buys land or housing, and it started in the United States over 50 years ago in the civil rights movement. The largest African-American property at the time was the first community land trust in the whole country. And basically, the land is owned by this nonprofit, which is managed by the community, and then the structures are owned by the individuals or rented by the individuals. And so what this means anyway, it's a housing strategy that preserves affordability both in booms when you would get gentrification and in busts where you would get foreclosure. Anyway, so they introduced this in Puerto Rico and said, how about our favela gets collective title through our community land trust, and then we own the homes and we can sell them, but they're affordable because the land is collectively owned and managed. And this points at where I think the solution needs to be, especially in consolidated neighborhoods where the heritage really is not only the built environment, but the culture and the people. I think that the people need to be the ones controlling the development of those areas. And the community land trust is actually a really robust way to do that legally in a regulated way. So I added a couple of slides at the end of my presentation that I thought might just be useful to respond to this question as well. One is comparing traditional development by governments in low-income communities with asset-based community development, which is a framework developed about 30 years ago in Chicago, in low-income communities in Chicago. And basically, the way we traditionally think about communities, and I would say maybe the heritage programs are similar, right? They come in, they say, what's missing? Let's identify the problems and offer technical solutions. We're going to be doing, essentially, in the case of low-income communities, government is thinking about doing a favor or doing charity with experts providing the solutions. And asset-based community development is the polar opposite of that. You come in thinking, okay, what's the value that's already here? And it doesn't need to be tangible. It often is intangible. And the community identifies those values. And then based on those, you use those as a springboard for addressing the challenges. So the qualities of the area are used, the existing qualities, not what's missing or what's lost. The existing qualities are used as a springboard for identifying opportunities to address the challenges. And the community that's there, they have the right to investment, and they have the right to belonging, they have the right to their roots, they have the right to their culture and heritage. And the communities are essentially in a mutual exchange with these technical allies. So this is something I think is a helpful framework for us to think. You know, we need to rethink how these processes are approached so that we don't get to a place where there are no people left, like Maria is describing, right? Where the people are gone. And so you've this whole part of heritage, which is really rooted in the people and the relationships there and to the area, that is much more difficult to recover, if possible at all, than rebuilding or you know, something like that physically. So I would say that intangible in this case is harder by virtue of it being intangible as well to reproduce. So we should be extra careful, and the people who know what that is are the residents, are the people who are living in that space, and they're the people who should be at the center of all the decisions.
Okay, thank you. And I'll pass to Professor Hassan.
Well, the question is quite interesting because I think it all depends on networking. Luckily, I had many contacts with artists and particularly painters and writers and journalists. So through my own personal network, I was exploiting that to the hilt. In addition, you know, I have been very familiar with the area, and it's one of my areas where I would go a lot. So I have good contacts in the area and could speak the language, so to speak, and be accepted by them. In addition, we also have in the program that we co-directed, Maria and I, we have many students who had their own contacts, and through them we were able to penetrate that society and be able to work effectively with them. In addition to going to the leaders in the community, like the one who interpreted the dreams and so forth. We also have contacts with a local NGO that was quite helpful. So I think a partnership is one of the things that we have to keep in mind, and not to think that we can be able to do it ourselves. Specialties, different specialties, but I would like in this regard to go back to one of the key points that was made by Teresa on the Sustainable Development Goals. And you mentioned that there are a couple of things that have to be added, like the sense of belonging, and you have to begin with the idea of social justice rather than, you know, with the 17 ones when you showed the tree. When I examined that in light of what I have been doing and in light of the presentation that were made today, I think there's also something lacking in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is an emphasis on innovation and new ideas. I think we have to start with partnerships and innovation, new ways by which we can solve these intractable problems. But the third one, which I also see in all the participants, is commitment and passion and compassion. I think with those three, you can then begin to focus on education in conjunction with economically sustainable projects, because you cannot just continue to depend on grants. We have to enable these communities to be productive so that they can minimize poverty, but in the meantime undergo social development. So therefore, once this is done, they would be able to tackle all kinds of other projects like access to water, sewage, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there is a need to re-examine the SDGs and to reframe it from a processual perspective to allow us to see where we would start. If I may, if you allow me, then I can just add another point to the work I'm starting now to do, and that was also in one of the earlier webinars we had on tourism, in which we introduced architecture. I mentioned it because it ties with what we have all talked about, the community and its engagement. And some of you may know of Hassan Fathi, is an architect that looked at the urban environment and tried to engage in social and economic development, not just the style of building. And so we are trying to revive his dream, so to speak, as a means by which we can use his legacy for advancing this connection between the tangible and the intangible. The problem there is maybe the reverse of what we have seen, is that the community, the living community there, is destroying that legacy and not aware of that heritage and do not care about this heritage, which is of world importance and of importance to the nation. And I think our project aims to re-engage the community by letting them know the value of this, because they do not know the value of what they have. They are, in fact, guardians of a jewel, and it can be a source of income as well as a source of pride. So we are beginning a series of activities like engaging the kids. You know, in last thing I've done there was to get paper and color pencils and get the kids to go and draw his houses and to tell them a story about Grandpa Fathi and what he has done, and in celebration of his birthday. And we had balloons and candles and so forth. So this way, the kids at least will begin to appreciate what their parents have not been appreciating. So this is just one point I tried to interject here, because this connection with historical cities and communities like that, informal or marginalized, is of great importance, not just limited to specific areas, because this is a world problem in terms of housing and the relation between housing and development all over the world for the majority of people in rural communities, as well as people who are living in advanced urban areas who are now suffering from problems of dealing with climate change and whatever. So I think there are lessons that can be learned, as Teresa showed us, from these communities that can be transferred and upscaled to urban communities. This way, we have, in fact, a mission to the whole world.
Thank you. We have a comment, and we have some comments from our public, and I'll read it to you. We have a first comment from Joe Buchanan. Thank you for such a good insight and talks. As Teresa Williamson says, we need a new model that is decentralized. I do feel, however, that the intrinsic connection from UNESCO with powerful stakeholders like nation states and economic value is a huge hurdle, leading to over-commodification and loss of local ownership, be it cities, carnival-shaped to suit the tourist gaze. It is good to see a push for local voices and models. Change is needed. And then there's another comment from Dunia Verney to Professor Feki Hassan that she would like to stay in contact with you. So there's a comment for you. And so I think I would add something to this discussion, that Professor Maria, just to wrap up, because we have 10 minutes maybe, and encourage people to ask also if they wish to ask something, we still have time. But she ended up saying that we must fight this situation with militants and politics. But it seems that in certain places we have a lot of militants, such as in the favelas, because the favela inhabitants that are saying, well, sorry, this is heritage for us. This is our history. We are part of Brazilian history. We're part of the urban fabric of the cities. We're not going by. We're here 100 years. And so a memory is something that is missed out. And we are presenting this. And so, for instance, if you go to the national heritage in Brazil and say, how about protecting a favela? We're not sure, or we could guess what would come from this. So there's a lot of militants. And in some places, such as in France, there might be a lot of politics in heritage. But I would ask, is there militants? Is people engaged in protecting the shops? I know that there were shops protections in the 80s in France, in Paris. I'm aware of that. But nowadays, are people engaging in the preservation of this everyday shops? Are they worried? I mean, is there any kind of research that you carry on this matter? If people in upscale neighborhoods such as these with a lot of tourists, where there's no more, for instance, kindergartens, is people engaging in these places? And I would ask the same thing to Professor Hassan, because and if we think about tangible and intangible, it's two different ways of policy making for heritage, and we are speaking here of a third way. Maybe there has to be a different category that puts together what people do and how they do as intangible, when linked it with the places. So in the case of Egypt, it seemed to me that they are really there. This people, it seemed to me, I was quite astonished when you said, no, people don't really engage. And I saw, it seemed that there is engagement in so many levels. So I would leave you with this question. If you could do your remarks and talks and reply or not to this, and any other things you wish to add to this discussion. I'm so sad that we lost Professor Sol. It seems that he's not coming back, because he was talking about another form of tangible and intangible situation in natural culture that was kind of very interesting. So but maybe we can engage with him in another moment. So I'll pass to you. I'll do the same, go to Maria and then Teresa and Professor Hassan. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is a very interesting question. Yes, in fact, there is militants also in Paris, including in these very central and very bourgeois areas. There are some powerful associations who really fight against the disappearance of everyday shops, for example. However, we don't speak about the same kind of militants than in Rio, because those guys, who are they? They are the gentrifiers of the 1980s. So they came to Le Marais in the 1980s in an area in which, I mean, this early gentrification was possible. And now they are fighting a phenomenon that we can identify as super gentrification, means the gentrification of an already gentrified place. This super gentrification comes in a huge extent from tourism, because even those gentrifiers cannot fight against the the plus-value, the added value of the tourism rentals, for example. So yeah, there is militants, but this is a kind of bourgeois militants of a kind of very nice lifestyle, which is in fact produced in the Marais. And just take the example of Le Marais, but we can speak about other central areas. And they fight, in fact, for their interests. It's more or less a kind of NIMBY, not in my backyard phenomenon, not comparable with what I believe Teresa was explaining, and that happens today in Rio. On the other hand, Flavia, you said that we have a lot of politics in Paris. Yeah, there are policies, but in fact, not really for intangible heritage. This is the problem. I mean, the problem comes partly, as I understand, from the overpresence, the overimportance of tools for tangible heritage, and in fact, very, very few tools that exist today for intangible heritage. The only tool, the only radical tool that exists is to buy something. The only way you do have today really to manage that this thing will host this kind of function, this place, this shop, this is really to buy it. So there are not any other tools more flexible, less costly, because of course the city of Paris can buy 1 shop, 2 shops, 3 shops, but how many shops can they buy? This is not possible because it's not the city who buys, it's me and the other people who live in another areas in Paris. So we are buying, in fact, the public money is invested in order that these gentrified areas, in fact, still have fresh baguette every day. So, I mean, they're very strange phenomena. Yeah, thank you. Just to be very short and say that they are very, very complex. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Great answer. And Teresa, if you wish to reply or respond.
Sure. Yeah, I was just thinking in Paris, I mean, I was imagining, so there are places where community land trusts aren't for housing. They can be for community gardens, or there's one in Cooper Square in Manhattan that's been around for decades where there's shop fronts, and they decide, the community land trust decides what kinds of shops they think should be there. And sometimes it's artists, photographers. So I'm just thinking you could have, and in Burlington, Vermont, in the States, the city encouraging, has policies encouraging the CLT for housing. And there's one case in Boston where the CLT has eminent domain power given by the city within an area to essentially, whenever an area and housing opens up, they have first purchase and they can. So I'm just imagining you could have a situation where a city government enables some sort of organization that is represented by citizens to try to preserve these intangibles in some way. But coming to Brazil and thinking about the militancy or the activism in favelas, I think I'm hopeful because even though, like Flavia said, the people in favelas are aware of, often increasingly aware of the intangible qualities in their communities and the values, and people in power aren't usually amenable to recognizing and acting on that. There has been a significant shift in the 20 years I've been working in terms of the strengthening of these community movements on so many different levels, whether it's the quality of community journalists and communicators, the use of social media, people from favelas, Black women from favelas, for example, getting positions of power in local government, access to university. And often it's interesting, 20, 30 years ago, if people in favelas made it out of poverty and they would often leave their communities and lead a middle-class lifestyle outside of a favela. And I think there's been a shift where perhaps because back then it wasn't through education, it was through manual, often family businesses and so on, that people would break out of poverty. So a lot of the social stigmas, they would carry them with them, and they wouldn't necessarily be reflecting on those as in the process of upward mobility. Whereas nowadays, many of the young people who are growing in their economic pursuits, it's through access to university. And so critical thinking is embedded in the way that they're improving their outcomes. And so they tend to want to stay in communities and fight for improvement. I think they're on a number of fronts. I think I'm more hopeful that there's going to be a shift. I don't know when it'll come, but I think that there is growing possibility that's going to happen. For me, it's really inevitable. It's just a matter of whether it's years or decades or longer. But I think it's definitely, that's where the trends are. And of course, there's a backlash. Mm-hmm.
So Professor?
Yes, well, this is really all exciting because we are dealing now with the nitty-gritty of the problems on how to carry on change on the ground. And I think the issue that you've raised about awareness of the heritage and how many people would be involved with is quite important. And in Egypt, of course, heritage, although it was not called heritage as such, there is a sense of the pharaonic past, the Islamic past, and so on. So there are many aspects of that heritage, and I think we have tweaked the concept, because in Arabic the word heritage actually sort of is specified to religious heritage. So over the last decade, we have been shifting the discourse so that it is no longer in Egypt associated with the religious heritage and means what UNESCO and we are all talking about. I think that was a major shift in the way Egyptians looked at heritage. With that in mind, as I mentioned, that was why it was important to bring those intellectuals and artists and painters, etc., because they have a voice in the community, have a voice they are read by the local people, at least the educated children, and they are heard by the government, and some of them sit on committees and are in very important positions. So, and in fact, this is the way I'm trying to work on this Hassan Fathi revitalization of architecture and sustainable development. And it will be based, the formula that we are working on now is to engage the private sector. Those in the private sector that are willing to go through a system with like social entrepreneurs with social commitment. So we are educating the people in the tourist sector, using people that are actually connected both in tourism, and some of them had previously high positions in the government. And so creating this private-public partnership is going to be very important, and bringing in the community and the benefits to them, because obviously the project would not be meaningful. We will end up again with a phenomenon like what Maria objected to. We don't want the Hassan Fathi village to become a playground for international architects coming and looking at this unified vision of Hassan Fathi. But we want it to be an actual living experience. And I insist on showing the experiments that the people have done. You know, from our point of view, they've destroyed this wonderful heritage, but we have to understand why they destroyed it in the way they did. Was it imitating the elite, imitating the relatives in Cairo when they go and want to build with cement and have different stories? Well, there are symbolic reasons for that. And so we have done a sociological, ethno-sociological study of the way, why people modify things in a certain way. And are they satisfied with their houses now? Would they be living in something different? So engaging the community from children all the way to the grown-ups, I think that triad, by bringing the government, the private sector, and the community together, can be the combination we are trying to see how it will work.
So thank you very much to all the panelists. I think we had a really, really interesting session today. We had, it was a quite interesting day. We have had already two sessions, and this was the third one for the day. And I think the living heritage, this tangible and intangible heritage, is really a trend in heritage discussions. We will go over this a lot in the next years or decades. As Teresa said, we had a lot to discuss because the policies are going on. There's a lot of results in intangible. We have a long past with the tangible, and so there's a lot of room to discuss. So I am really, really inspired by all the talks. I would like to welcome you all for the further discussions. Tomorrow we'll have, in a certain way, a continuity of this discussion. That we have a session 7. It's the participatory process and new narratives in heritage, the role of civil society. In a way, we talked about it today, and so we continue further with this. And we also have the presentation of videos in the project Now Cultural in Portuguese. So cultural now. And so thank you, Monica and Vera. And if you wish to add something, and it was a great honor for me to be here. And thank you all. We had a good audience and for today, and the discussion will go on.
Thank you very much, Flavia, to be moderating this excellent session. I would like to congratulate our guest speakers and to thank you very, very much for this very inspiring session and very thought-provoking inputs that you bring to us. Thank you very much.
And also thank you, Flavia, for moderating this very, very important debate, and also from the University of São Paulo. And also I would like to thank you all coming from Federal University of Rio as a convener for this webinar. It was a very, very important discussion, and all everyone is asking for your contacts because they want to just deepen the conversation here. So thank you so much, Flavia, and also Teresa, Maria, and Fakri, and also Sol. And I hope you'll continue with us tomorrow with our session 7, our Now Cultural, the cultural ship. And also on Friday, you have 3 more sessions. So a very, very rich debates that are taking over this 3 weeks of June. So I hope you can join us in the next session. Thank you so much and have a very nice evening, day, afternoon.
Thank you, Vera.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
We encourage everyone to register at the website. Thank you.
Yes. Visit the website and you can see all the sessions, and then you can just join us. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.